It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Darwall, who I'm sure is known to all of you, and in fact is in many ways the only begetter of this conference, in that his work on the second person standpoint has inspired many of us to recognize that this is a fundamental part of the philosophical agenda which has not been visited properly until he turned his attention to it, at least not visited by practitioners of analytical philosophy. Stephen Darwall is Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy at Yale and also an Emeritus Professor at the University of Michigan, and has written widely on moral philosophy from the point of view of the second person standpoint, about which he has written a very important book, which I'm sure you will all either have read already or be intending to read after this conference. And I invite him now to address the question of making the hard problem of moral normativity easier. Stephen, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Roger. Can you hear me in the back there? Yeah, good, okay. And thanks so much also to Andrew and the other organizers of the conference, and to other participants and the attendees. This has been a wonderful conference so far, and there's a lot still to come. So what I want to talk about is in some ways an ancient problem. It arises in the Republic, for example, but it takes a distinctively modern form, I think, from the 17th century at least on, and that is, why be moral? In particular, why should an agent do what is morally obligatory, that is, what morality demands or requires of us, not just what it would be good to do or what might instantiate a virtue of some kind, but what morality demands, if this is against the agent's interest or against her ends. Now, this has seemed to be a hard normativity problem. So there's the, just stepping back a bit, there's the general problem, philosophical problem of normativity. How could there be any oughts in a world of is's, roughly, or any values in a world of fact? That's the sort of standard philosophical problem of normativity in general. So that's just a question, how could there be normative reasons for anything? To believe something, to desire something, to care about things, and so on. What we're concerned with is, how could there be normative reason to do what one's morally obligated to do? And my claim is that though it's been thought to be easier to show that people have normative reasons to do what's in their interest or to do what will advance their aims, in fact, it's not easier to show that. In fact, it's harder to show that. It's easier to show that there's reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. So, uncontroversial background, I'll be assuming that morality is normative in some sense or other. And that's been agreed by and large by the people who've participated in this debate, let's say, from the 1960s on. I'm thinking primarily here of Philippa Foot's famous paper in 1972, Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives, stipulate that there is such a thing as morality, stipulate that there are things we're morally required to do, but then Foot asks, why suppose that we actually have reason to do these things? She's prepared to grant that morality provides reasons, as she puts it, from the moral point of view. But as she also challenges, etiquette provides reasons from the point of view of etiquette as well. The question is whether what there is reason to do from some point of view, there's reason to do, as we might put it, period, not just from that point of view. The challenge is also to show that there's reason to do what we're morally obligated to do, not just for some other reason, like it advances somebody's interest. I mean, that's the distinctive point of the modern period, the modern conception of morality, that even when eudaimonistic reasons run out, there is reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. as Pritchard put it, to try to base morality on reasons of self-interest or the good of the agent, however widely construed, rests moral philosophy on a mistake. So first, let me try to convince you that this problem, the normativity of moral obligation, is no harder than that of other kinds of normative reasons that people standardly accept, like considerations of self-interest or considerations about what would advance one's ends. Again, it's a conceptual truth that what is in someone's interest gives that person reasons from the point of view of their interests, or as I might think of it, as from the point of view of someone who cares for that person, say that person, him or herself. The real question is whether, even if you don't care for someone, even if you don't care for yourself, is there reason for you to pursue your own interest? So note the following two propositions. One, the fact that A, an action A, would promote S's good is a reason for S to do A. Okay, that's a normative proposition. And two, the fact that A would advance S's end is a reason for S to do A. Okay. Now, the first point I want to make is that neither one of these is a conceptual truth. If they're true, they're substantive normative truths. In fact, many people think that the second isn't true. Almost everybody believes the first is true, but I think most people these days think that the second isn't true. They think that it's irrational, it's irrational simultaneously to be pursuing an end, but to refuse to take a means to that end. But they don't think that the fact that you have the end itself gives you a normative reason to pursue the means, because you might have no reason to have the end. In fact, you might have reasons not to have the end. Okay. So the first point is that neither one nor two is a tautology or a conceptual truth. Either could be coherently denied. So to feel the force of that point with respect to proposition one, I like to think of the possibility of a rational depressive. So imagine someone who has full command of the concept of reason for acting, understands what it is for one thing to be a reason for something else, but who is depressed, who doesn't care about himself, thinks his life isn't worth caring about, and so thinks that the fact that something would be for his good gives him no reason at all to pursue that thing. Okay, that seems like I'm not saying it's true. I think it's false, actually. But it's a coherent position. And if it's a coherent position, then the proposition that considerations of self-interest do give us reasons is not conceptually guaranteed. So even if it's true that the fact that something is morally obligatory doesn't conceptually guarantee that there's reason to do that thing taken by itself, that makes it no different from considerations of self-interest or the question of whether something would advance one's ends is a reason for one to do that thing. So the questions, why do what is in my interest or why do what will promote my ends, those are both substantive normative questions. And somebody who asks that question is not betraying some failure to understand the concept of reasons for acting. So they're no less substantive normative questions than the question, why do what I'm morally obligated to do? Okay, so I take that to show then that in each case, although it's uncontroversial that, let's say, the fact that something is in my interest gives me reason from the point of view of my interests, it's not uncontroversial, it's deniable that the fact that something is in my interest gives me a reason, period, to perform the act. So it's uncontroversial that the relevant prospective qualified reasons exist, just as Foote said about moral reasons, but that makes morality no worse off in this respect than pretty much anything. So I'm not going to argue for it here, but I would just suggest that any proposition that something or other gives us a reason for acting or to desire something or for any attitude, that's going to be a substantive normative claim, not conceptually guaranteed just by the concept of a reason. Okay. So I conclude then, the problem of moral normativity is no harder than that of prudential and instrumental normativity is no easier. Now, the more interesting part of what I have to say, I hope, is that when we understand what the normativity of moral obligation is, we'll see that it's actually easier to show that there is reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. And here I'm going to be relying upon claims and arguments that I've made before, for example, in the second-person standpoint. The basic idea is that morality is an irreducibly second-personal phenomenon in the sense that what it is for something to be morally obligatory is for it to be the case that that action, that failing to perform that action would be warrantedly blamed. It would be blameworthy were the action to be taken without excuse, where blame is understood as a distinctively second-personal attitude. Okay, so let's see how this is supposed to go. So the guiding assumption behind this is that all normative concepts are normative for some attitude or other. Another way of putting this is in terms that Derek Parfit uses in his most recent On What Matters. All normative concepts are reason-involving concepts. So, for example, the concept of the desirable. Well, that's just the concept of what there is reason to desire. The concept of the credible. Well, that's just the concept of what there is reason to believe, where desire and belief are distinctive attitudes. The choice-worthy. Well, that's just what there is reason to choose. Dignity, I would argue, is that of what which there is reason to recognize or have recognition, respect toward. The culpable, well, that's the concept of the blameworthy, what there is reason to blame. Okay? So then what we want to ask is, what's distinctive about moral obligation, and how to understand its normativity? So I'm not going to go through what's on the screen now. These are just other ways of using that same framework to define perspectival practical normative concepts. What something is being desirable from a point of view, or choice-worthy from a point of view. So in each case, we can ask this, in the case of self-interest, yes, okay, this is what's desirable from the agent's point of view, or from the point of view of someone who cares for the agent. But then there's the further substantive question, is there reason, period, for anyone, even the agent himself, to pursue that thing? So similarly, we can, you might think we could ask the same thing when it comes to morality, but I'm going to try to convince you that you actually can't when you understand the distinctive nature of moral obligation. The moral ought understood in distinctively Deontic terms as what it would be wrong not to do, or what we're morally demanded to do or required to do. So now let's think a little bit about the concept of moral obligation and the related concepts, Deontic concepts of moral right and wrong, and demand, and so on. Now, there's a general, as Alan Gibbard calls it, flavorless sense of ought, where it just means favored by normative reasons of some relevant kind. So we can talk about what I prudentially ought to do, where that just means something like what there is normative reason to do in terms of my self-interest. Or we can talk about an instrumental ought, where that means what reasons, if there are any, deriving from my ends, favor. And And in this sense, we could also talk about a kind of moral ought that is reason involving in Parfit's sense. It would just mean, and I think a lot of actually British moral philosophers, though not Parfit now, it's interesting, Parfit has changed in his most recent book in ways that I think are much more in the direction that I'm trying to point. But it's been a pretty standard view that what it means for something to be something we morally ought to do is just that there are moral reasons that support that action. Okay? But I think actually the phrase morally ought is ambiguous. It's ambiguous between the notion I just pointed to, that is, what moral reasons favor, and a different, distinctively deontic notion of requirement and demand, of what we're obligated to do. Because notice, it just doesn't follow in general from the fact that there are reasons of a certain kind in favor of something that it would be wrong not to do that action. It doesn't follow even from there being a balance of moral reasons in favor of an action that it would be wrong not to perform the action. Wrong in the sense that it would violate a moral requirement or a moral demand. So here's one way I think that you can see this point. This is a kind of argument that's familiar to philosophers from G.E. Moore in Principia Ethica, a kind of open question argument. I was actually giving you an open question argument earlier when I was trying to convince you that someone could coherently deny that considerations of self-interest are reasons. But here's a different version. Suppose someone is faced with a situation where there's another person who is in danger, whose life is threatened, let's say. Maybe they're in a building, it's an earthquake, we could imagine, and the building is, might collapse at any moment. Buildings are collapsing all around. But the agent is in a position possibly to save someone in the building. Okay? Now, I want you to imagine not that it would be foolhardy to go in, so that it would be morally, arguably against even a duty, let's say, of to oneself for the agent to go in. Imagine that it's very risky, but it's not so risky that it would be wrong to go in. But imagine also that the risks are sufficient that someone might think coherently that though it would be good for the agent to take the risk, the agent isn't morally required to take the risk. Okay? That it would be, as we sometimes say, supererogatory. Now, I'm not asking you to believe that there is such a thing as supererogation. I'm just asking you whether you don't believe that it's someone could coherently believe that there's such a thing as supererogation. That is, it's left open by the concept whether there's such a thing as supererogation. So if someone were to say, for example, gee, I think it would be very good of you to go in, there certainly are moral reasons that support going in, but if you don't go in, I don't think you'll have done wrong, that person wouldn't be engaged in some kind of incoherent thought, some kind of self-contradiction, and so on. But if that's true, if supererogation is so much as conceptually possible, then it just follows that the concept of moral obligation can't be the same concept as what moral reasons support. Because by hypothesis, moral reasons in this case support going in, but it wouldn't be wrong to not go in. Okay, so that's to try to convince you that that the concept of moral obligation is a different concept from the concept of what moral reasons most support or favor. Now, my diagnosis of why this is so is that moral obligation has a conceptual connection to accountability. What we're morally obligated to do is what we are accountable doing or responsible for doing. And what it would be blameworthy not to do, were one to fail to do it without excuse, where blame is the attitude through which we hold someone accountable. Okay? So my conceptual claim is that if it's morally obligatory for S to do A, then it's also true necessarily that S would be blameworthy were S to do A, to fail to do A without valid excuse. And here I'm relying upon a kind of analysis of blame as a reactive attitude that we owe to Peter Strawson in his famous paper, Reason, Freedom, and Resentment. So Strawson's idea is that blame is a distinctive kind of attitude. It's what he calls a reactive attitude. And these attitudes are essentially, he says, interpersonal. And by that he means not just that they have another person as object, but they involve an implicit relating to the object. So they are, in the terms of this conference and in my terms, second personal. They always involve an implicit address of a demand to the object of the attitude. But they don't simply make a demand as a naked demand, as a kind of power move. They address a putatively legitimate demand. And they invite, or perhaps in some ways demand, the recognition of the other's recognition of one's authority to issue the demand. So they always come with what I call an RSVP, unlike other critical attitudes. So let me try to show you this vividly with an example that I have in a footnote of my book. Careful students of my book will know a footnote. But anyway, this depicts a moment in not the most recent Winter Olympics, but the one before that in Turin, Italy, and you have two Italian ice dancers. There's Barbara Fusarpoli and Maurizio Margaglio, and they're skating. Well, you don't actually get to see here where they're skating. Believe me, before it was great. They were this close to a silver medal. But Maurizio was holding up Barbara Fusarpoli, and he dropped her. Okay? And there you see them tumbling to the ice. And then after a long period of time, when they were on the ice, they got up, and that's Barbara. Well, this was referred to as the stare. Okay. And, there she is even more. Okay. Now, I want you to consider the hypothesis that she's feeling a reactive attitude. This seems plausible, right? Yeah, okay, good. Now, the point, though, is that it's clearly she's looking to him, and suppose he were to look away at that point, would she be pleased? I don't think so, right? I mean, she might, if he were to look down, perhaps. But the idea is that blame or resentment implicitly addresses a demand to its object and invites the object to take responsibility for and to hold himself or herself accountable to the person feeling the reactive attitude. Okay? And I want you to compare this with a very different kind of attitude, namely contempt or disdain, not a looking daggers attitude, but a rolling eyes attitude. So we can imagine, she's on the phone, and let's suppose it's to the boyfriend, and the boyfriend says, "Oh, something came up, I can't be there," and she's thinking, "Oh, again, there he goes again." Okay, so rolling eyes attitudes, contempt is a kind of rolling eyes attitude, Why? Because though it may have a person as its object in the same way that blame or resentment has a person as its object, it doesn't implicitly address its object in the same way. So if she's thinking, there he goes again, obviously that's not addressed to him. It's addressed, if you like, to, as I like to call them, the cognoscenti off stage, the people who get it, who can see that, what a deadbeat this guy is. Okay? So there's a distinction between reactive attitudes, and Strawson's article, Freedom and Resentment, has had just a massive influence in discussions in action theory and freedom of the will and moral psychology. Its influence relies upon this distinction that Strawson's making between a way of viewing people that's distinctively interpersonal, or in my term, second personal, versus what he calls an objective attitude, where you're just seeing the person not relating to the person. And the thought is that contempt is an objective attitude in those forms, whereas blame and resentment are essentially reactive attitudes. Now, what's distinctive about blame as opposed to resentment? Resentment is felt coherently only by the victim or by people who identify with the victim or have some particular relationship to the victim. There are other attitudes that are no less reactive attitudes than resentment, like indignation or blame. But they are, Strawson says, impersonal as opposed to personal reactive attitudes. The term impersonal is a little unfortunate, I think, because it can encourage us to lose sight of the fact that impersonal reactive attitudes like blame, which can be felt by third parties, you don't have to be the victim or someone who identifies with the victim to blame someone. For example, you could blame yourself for something, as in guilt. So the idea of blame, that attitude is a third-party attitude in the sense that it's felt as if from anybody's perspective. Okay? So it's part of the idea of blaming someone that you're seeing what they did as blameworthy. But you don't judge blameworthiness distinctively from any particular position. I mean, epistemically, there are some positions that are better to judge it, but it's not as if only some people have the authority to blame. Blame sort of goes with the moral community. So the way I like to think about it is blame or indignation are felt as if from the perspective of the moral community or as if from the perspective of a representative person. And so they presuppose a kind of representative authority that any person has to hold himself and others accountable. Okay, so if you buy all this so far, what you get is that it's part of the very idea of moral obligation that if an action is morally obligatory, it's an action of a kind that it would be blameworthy to fail to perform were the agent to perform it without excuse. So there's a conceptual connection between the idea of moral demand, requirement, or obligation on the one hand, and the second personal notion of what we're accountable for doing and what we rightly hold ourselves and hold one another accountable for doing with reactive attitudes like resentment, blame, and so on. And now here's the crucial point for the why be moral question. It's just a presupposition of blaming someone for doing something that you must believe if you're the person who's blaming. And your blame can be justified only if there was a good reason for the person not to have done what you're blaming them for doing. Okay? So another way to think about this is this. Suppose I blame Jones for doing A. I can't coherently simultaneously accept and maintain that Jones had good reason to do A. That would be incoherent. So blame is a distinctive attitude of a kind that Strawson has helped us to see. It has this distinctively interpersonal, second-personal character, but it also comes with a presupposition. And you can see this because if the person did have a good reason to do what she did, then she has a justification. But justifications defeat blameworthiness. Blameworthiness can be defeated by two different things. It can be defeated by a justification, and it can be defeated by an excuse. Justifications show that there was, in fact, good reason for the person to do what she did, and so she isn't blameworthy. Excuses acknowledge that there wasn't good reason for the person to do what she did, but nonetheless excuse her doing it as the result of some excusing condition, whether it's ignorance or overwhelming, unreasonable emotional trauma or whatever it might be. Okay? So it's a presupposition of blame that there is reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. Another way of putting this point is that blame differs from a view about what there is good reason for the person to do, or not to have done, I guess. In fact, it also differs from a view about what's blameworthy. This actually came up in at least one, if not two, of the talks yesterday. Think about it in terms of, actually, so Peter had that marvelous quote from Wittgenstein, "I'm not of the opinion that he has a soul, but I relate to him," or what was it? What's the rest of the quote, do you remember? Have the attitude towards him. Yeah, so but the thought would be, I'm not of the opinion that he has a soul, I relate to him as having a soul, something like that. So likewise with blame, I'm not of the opinion, so blaming someone isn't just being of the opinion that the person did something that was blameworthy, it's having the attitude of blame towards them, which is implicitly relating to them, but the justification for that attitude is staked on there not being a justification for what the person did. Because if there was a justification, then the action wouldn't be blameworthy. So blame necessarily presupposes the existence of a reason, period. And the thing to notice is that blame lacks a prudential analog. So I might think that there's good prudential reason for you to do something, and I might think you ought to do it for that reason, but that doesn't in any way commit me to blaming you for not doing it if you don't do it, even if you have no excuse. Of course, there's a sense of blame in which I can criticize you. I can say, well, you didn't do what there was most reason to do. But that's not blame. Blame isn't just a view about what there's reason to do. It's this distinctive attitude which presupposes that there is reason not to have done what we blame someone for doing. So if blame is warranted, then these reasons must exist. If it's unwarranted, that reasons may not exist. But if it is warranted, these reasons must exist, since blame can be warranted only if they do exist. Okay? But now remember what we've agreed to at the outset. Well, not quite at the outset, sort of halfway through. I took your silence as agreement. Oh, that's manipulative. I shouldn't have done that. Okay. So if you agree that the concept of moral obligation is a different concept from the concept of what moral reasons support, and if you agree that there's a conceptual connection between moral obligation and accountability along the lines I've sketched, then you'll be agreeing that if an action is morally obligatory, it would be of a kind that it would be blameworthy to fail to perform, were you to fail to perform it without excuse. But if it would be blameworthy, then that means that there must have been reason not to do what the person, what it would be blameworthy for the person not to do. Okay? And the thought is, when you blame someone, you're not just thinking that there are reasons from the moral point of view for not doing what you're blaming them for doing. You're committed to thinking there are reasons, period. So I think this solves what I'm calling the hard problem of moral normativity, because it shows that there's necessarily some reason, period, and not just a reason from the point of view of morality to do what one is morally obligated to do. But I think actually, if we wanted to push our luck a little bit, we can solve an even harder problem of moral normativity. Because notice that in the argument I just gave, even if we just take it for the weaker conclusion that there's some reason to do what we're morally obligated to do, it looks like the argument actually, if it works, shows something stronger. Namely, that the reason to do what we're morally obligated to do is a conclusive reason. It's not overridden by other reasons. Why? Because again, if it were overridden, then the agent would have a justification for doing what we're blaming her for doing. Okay? So there wouldn't be reason to do, all things considered, what she's morally obligated to do. So a stronger conclusion follows. Not just that there's some reason to do what we're morally obligated to do, but there's conclusive reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. Now, I hasten to add, or to point out, that all of these claims I've been making are conceptual claims that might never be instantiated. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is roughly what Kant means when he says at the end of section 2 of the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, having shown by analyzing the concept of duty and moral goodness and so forth and so on, that if there's such a thing as morality, then its principle is the categorical imperative, and autonomy of the will follows, and the dignity of all persons follows. Kant says that's consistent with there being no such thing as morality. That's consistent with morality being a mere chimera, because these are just analytic claims. And if someone were to deny all claims of moral obligation, just saying, well, look, I grant you that if there were such a thing as moral obligation, then it would give reasons. But I just deny that there is any such thing. The arguments I've given to this point shouldn't convince that person otherwise. Okay? But notice we stipulated at the beginning that moral obligation is normative, that morality is normative. And I was trying to give you an analysis of what the distinctive normativity of moral obligation consists in. So now, at this point, the question comes down to, I mean, really, we could put it this way. I've tried to convince you that if there's such a thing as a normative reason to blame someone, then there will be, blame will be warranted under some conditions. And in that case, there'll be reason for the person not to have done what she's morally obligated not to have done. Okay? Now we can imagine a skeptic saying, why suppose there are any reasons to blame at all? I don't have time to try to answer this question sufficiently. But notice that what we need for this to be a worrisome challenge is some particular reason to be skeptical about the existence of normative reasons to blame that isn't just a general skepticism about the existence of normative reasons in general. Okay, so I started off talking about the well-known problem of how can there be any true oughts, or how can there be any true evaluative claims? That's the problem of normativity, perfectly general problem. That's not the problem. I face that problem. Anybody faces this problem. Anybody who thinks that anything is desirable faces that problem. Okay. In order to show that there's some reason to be skeptical about reasons for blame, we'd have to think that there's something about the attitude of blame that makes it different from other attitudes like belief and desire and esteem and respect and so on. We'd have to think that reactive attitudes are suspect. And by the way, not just suspect because they make our lives worse or something like that, because that would be not an issue about whether there is reason in itself to blame or whether anything could be fittingly blamed. That's the further question of whether blame is a useful attitude for us to have. But I never met anybody who had anything like a beginning of an argument for why there's any distinctive reason to be skeptical about the blameworthy. And so if there is no reason to be skeptical about that, then I think we don't have any reason to be skeptical about morality. And if we don't have any reason to be skeptical about morality, then I think we should accept what follows, I think, conceptually from the concept of moral obligation, namely that there's reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. And with that, I will thank you.
Rich and subtle paper model of analytical reasoning, as I expected, which is, I'm sure has left you all dumbfounded. There may be people foolhardy enough to have a question nevertheless. Yes, there is at least two.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to the question which problem is the easier and the harder, so
yeah.
the question that you started out with.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether it would make a difference if we formulated the claim about instrumental reasons in terms of an ongoing structured action. So
this is the Chicago perspective.
Yes.
Candace Vogler, yeah, right. Okay,
yes.
I hear the question.
So say that I'm building a house. So I'm in the process of building a house.
Right.
And taking the hammer and driving in the nail is a means for me to build the house.
Right.
And insofar as I'm building the house, it does seem, it seems like a good candidate for a reason to drive in the nail that I'm building a house. And if I don't, if that's not a reason for me to drive in the nail, then maybe I'm not building a house anymore. So at least insofar as I am actually engaged in this structured action, I have some reasons. There are some, so that's my question.
Yeah, so something in that direction is certainly right. And the question is how to understand that. So here's one thing that just seems clearly true, that it's irrational simultaneously to be pursuing an end, like building a house, believe that it's necessary to perform some action to pursue that end or to accomplish it, like hammering the nail, and refuse to intend to hammer the nail. Okay, so that's an incoherent set of attitudes. Not that it's incoherent that somebody could have the attitudes, but you're involved in some kind of irrationality, some kind of irrational incoherence if you have those three attitudes. Now, one thing that a number of philosophers who thought about this, John Broome, for example, say, is that what's true there is that there's a rational requirement of wide scope. What they mean by wide scope is you can comply with this requirement either by driving the nail or somehow by forming the belief, we hope for some reasons, that you don't need to drive this nail in order to build the house, or by giving up the end of building the house. Okay? So that seems true. It's uncontroversial. But it seems like, as far as that requirement of wide scope goes, it doesn't decide which one of those you should do. So I can just as rationally comply with that requirement by giving up my end of building the house as I can by driving the nail. And further, a lot of people think that, I think, for example, that you have reason to drive the nail only if you have reason to be building the house. So if you, most obviously, if you have reason not to be building the house, then what you should do is not drive the nail because you have the end of building the house. To the contrary, you should give up your end of building the house. Suppose building the house will, be wrong for some reason or something like that. So that's the way I try to understand it, that there's a kind of normative requirement of wide scope of rationality with respect to means and ends. But that doesn't mean that the end gives you a normative reason to pursue the means. That's the thought.
I think Eleanor had a question.
Thank you for a very lucid talk, which I enjoyed.
Thank you.
I want to see if I understand you correctly, and if I do, I want to ask a question. I mean, I take it you're saying something like this: focus on blame, think about blame, and you're going to get an answer to the question, why be moral? And you're also going to see that in a certain sense, moral reasons trump other reasons, prudential reasons or other reasons. But so here's what occurs to me. Blame comes in all different varieties. So consider the current trial of the gangster Whitey Bulger. So you can imagine the prosecutor saying to this guy who killed very many people, imagine him saying a blaming line, "You jerk." That's an expression.
Just the record, I think of jerk as a of course there are different forms of jerks. But
never mind. Then I'll use whatever term you like. How about you bastard, or would that work?
Yeah, that's closer. Yeah, I got that.
Okay, fine. You can imagine the prosecutor saying to Whitey, "You bastard," by which he means you immoral bastard.
Right.
But of course, Whitey is saying to the mobster who informed on him, "You bastard," by which he means you contemptible bastard, because you violated the codes of honor that are supposed to govern the mob.
Right, good.
And you can imagine the wife of the guy who informed on Whitey saying to her husband, "You bastard," by which she means you imprudent bastard, they could kill you, and then what would happen to me? So it looks as if blame comes in all these different varieties, which puts us right back at the starting point somehow.
Thank you very much for that. So it's kind of important to the way I'm seeing things that there's a difference between an expression of contempt and blame. So that was the point of the rolling eyes, but you can imagine other forms of contempt that aren't rolling eyes. You're exactly right. I mean, I actually read some reports, you maybe read the same reports in the newspaper about this trial, that some of the colleagues, is it Bulger, is that his name? Yeah, some of the colleagues of Bulger who were testifying against him were charging him with having violated a code of honor. I think it's an interesting difference about between codes of honor and morality. Of course, we can put these things together and we can think that it's immoral to violate a code of honor, but it's no part of the concept of having done something that justifies contempt that the person is accountable for doing it. In other words, contempt doesn't come with the RSVP. It doesn't hold its object answerable. It does, of course, lower its object. It sees its object as contemptible, as warranting contempt. But the crucial thought is that thinking that some action warrants contempt isn't the same thing as holding someone accountable in a way that calls for them to justify, if they can, their action.
I have a lot of questions. Gentleman in blue.
Just one follow-up for.
Oh, sorry.
Just one short follow-up. I mean, I disagree about contempt. If I say to you, you contemptible bastard, then I am addressing you. It is a reactive attitude. You're going to try to find but the point really I want to make is, see, here's the problem.
Yeah.
What's the difference then between the you immoral bastard directed toward Whitey Bulger and you contemptible bastard directed against the informant? Well, what you want to say is, look, one of these is blame, and only one of these is blame, and the one which is blame is the one that has to do with morality. Yeah. But then I'm beginning to get sort of anxious here that maybe we have things going in a circle.
Yeah. So, right. So I don't much care what we call morality. I think that whenever we've got the idea that something justifies blame, then we're committed to the thought that there was a reason for the person not to have done what we warrantedly blamed that person for doing, okay? And we may think, and then the thought is morality, or the concept of moral obligation, is conceptually connected to warranted blame in a way that concepts of honor and other concepts aren't conceptually connected to warranted blame. So the concept of prudence, for example, is not conceptually connected to warranted blame. I think that's what's doing the work in the argument.
Right. There are lots of questions. Can you just put up all your hands, those who have questions, and I can see how bad the situation is. Yeah. Okay, so I'll start off with the gentleman in blue in the middle here, but I think it's now going to be imperative to make your questions short and directed to the argument.
Thanks very much for your talk, and I want to ask a question about morality and the obligation that we ought to have, or that we do have, when we're by ourselves. So you're talking about morality, and you're analyzing, and the argument turns on this blame, which is a second personal dynamic. But I want to ask, how does this blameworthiness and its relation to obligation function when you're in a situation where no one's watching, where no one's there, and no one's there to blame you?
Right, good, thanks. So what I've said leaves it entirely open what our moral obligations are. And it leaves it open whether we have obligations to ourselves or not. Okay. My thought just is, if I think that I have an obligation to myself, then I'm committed to thinking that it would be blameworthy for me to fail to perform that action were I to perform it with that excuse. But blame doesn't have to be from some other person's standpoint, right? Guilt is self-blame. And guilt, obviously, can only be felt by the agent, him or herself, right? So the idea is that it's conceptually required that if an action is morally obligatory, there would be blameworthy to fail to perform it without excuse. Or we could put the same point by saying the action would warrant guilt were the agent to perform without excuse. So it doesn't really much matter where we situate things.
Hang on, I haven't actually selected you from the number of competitors yet, but I might as well, because I can see you're going to make trouble if I don't. So.
Yeah, I think maybe we should take a more difficult case than the case of the mafioso, where you could say, well, that this is a kind of particularistic moral code that we can't equate with morality as such. Let's take the case of Edward Snowden, who is wanted by the US government for espionage, but is regarded as a moral hero by many people. Yeah. The US government is blaming him for committing espionage, for violating the conditions of his contract of employment and so forth.
Right.
Now, what are you going to do? Don't situations like that potentially invite skepticism about the very notion of morality, because you've got incommensurable judgments, you've got incommensurable forms of blame?
Well, it seems to me like what you're raising is just the general problem of moral skepticism. I don't think it's, let's say the people who feel that Snowden is a hero, they certainly aren't skeptics about morality. They think that he's done a morally praiseworthy thing. The government's not in a position actually itself to blame. The government's in a position to bring a charge, a legal charge.
But I've heard many representatives of the US government talking in moral terms about Snowden's blame.
Of course they may talk in moral terms. I'm just saying that the government is as government only in a position to bring a legal action. Of course, it's important to our understanding of the normativity of law that it's backed by some kind of an assumption of culpability or blameworthiness. So in a criminal trial, for example, the issue of culpability arises, and that's right in the territory that we're talking about. People will have different views about what's culpable, but that doesn't mean that, and let's suppose it may be difficult to tell who's right and who's wrong. I find skepticism about morality here a kind of grim possibility.
You seem to want to negotiate this problem by saying that, from the standpoint of the US government, he's legally culpable, but not morally culpable. But why isn't he morally culpable for violating the conditions of his contract of employment?
Well, that's a substantive normative question. I'm not prepared to discuss it one way or the other. Except as a human being with my own moral views. But as a philosopher here defending a certain conception of morality, that question is just left entirely open by what I'm saying.
Right. Alexandra and
So it's connected to some question. So if blame, so your argument relies a lot on the conceptual analysis of blame, and you assume the Straussian concept of blame. But conventionally, we use blame in different ways. So if I fail to help a friend, but I have no reason for failing to help him, say I just want to hang out in my room and not do anything important, I can be blameworthy in this conventional use without me being required to do it. And I wonder how, what you can say about this kind of case.
So I'm not sure I've got the case right. So what is it I'd be blameworthy for doing?
For failing to help my friend, even though I'm not required morally to help him.
Okay.
So it's a case because your argument relies on the claim that blame is conceptually tied to obligatoriness, moral obligation. Yeah, and I'm saying in our conventional use of the term, it may be a bit different from the Straussian one.
So let me see if I understand this. So you're suggesting the set of the blameworthy might be wider than the set of violating of moral demands or requirements.
Supererogatory action, not supererogatory.
Yeah. Right. So actually, I think my argument doesn't require me to think that all blameworthy actions would violate moral obligations. It just requires the other way around. Right, so the question is whether there's reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. So we stipulate that someone's morally obligated to do something. I then am claiming that if the person's morally obligated to do something, that it would be blameworthy for them to fail to do it without excuse. Okay, and then the argument works as it works. You're saying, well, something could be blameworthy without violating a moral requirement. Maybe. Now, stepping away from the argument, if I were just to consider that possibility, it's an interesting possibility that I'd have to think. It's very much worth thinking about. Thanks.
Andrew?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to ask a question about the sort of language that you use to express your arguments. And it's always the phrases you use very much about giving reasons for this, Desiring is thinking that something is desirable. Dignity is having a reason to respect. Morality very much in terms of accountability. Now, people like Robert Audi and others often talk about moral perception. That it's possible to see morality without necessarily having able to give reasons from inferential reasoning from non-moral statements. Presumably you wouldn't agree with that, and I would wonder why, and how would you argue against the notion of moral perception?
Well, presumably I wouldn't, you're saying I wouldn't agree with that.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
No, sorry. I'm just wanting to understand the question. Are you saying,
okay.
presumably I would not agree with that?
Well, the way that you scope your argument is very much in terms of giving reasons for things. I just wondered whether you thought there was a space for such a thing as moral perception. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly compatible with the view. So I take it that if you perceive that something's morally wrong, then you're perceiving, well, hold on. Well, so in my view, if you're perceiving that an action is morally wrong, then you're perceiving that it would be blameworthy to do it without excuse, which is to perceive that there is reason to blame someone. Well, so I just mean, so there's the phrase, there is reason, okay? There's justification. You may not know what the justification is, or you may not be able to perceive what the justification is. So they're very interesting questions here. All that follows from the conceptual analysis is wrongness entails blameworthiness without excuse, okay? Blameworthiness entails there is reason to blame. Okay, that's all that follows. Now, so if I can perceive the wrongness of an action, I have to be able to perceive that it would be blameworthy to perform it without excuse. That's fine. I might be able to perceive that without perceiving what the reasons are for blaming it. Okay, that might require a certain kind of philosophy to sort of reflect on and so on.
Just one very quick follow-up. Would it be possible to have moral perception if you were unable to reason syllogistically?
Yeah. I think so, actually. Yeah, I mean, so I'm answering this not because, in this vein, because I believe there's such a thing as moral perception. I'm just saying, if I accepted all the things I'm arguing for in this talk, I could believe there's such a thing as moral perception, and I could also believe that people could see that something is supported by reason, even if they couldn't articulate or distinguish the reasons that support the thing. Sure.
Right, the gentleman with the blue checked shirt there, yes. Wait for the microphone if you can.
Thank you. Since the problem originated from the question about the relation between having moral reasons or reasons from a certain point of view and having reasons, period, I wonder about the following form of objection. You try to solve the problem by tying between moral obligations and having reasons, period, through the concept of blame.
Right.
So I wonder about someone who would say something along the following lines. Yes, there's a conceptual relation between moral obligation and warranted blame, perhaps. But warranted blames doesn't go with having reasons, conclusive reasons, period. It goes with having moral reasons, period. Yeah. So if there's no moral justification for what you did, you are blameworthy. But you might have prudential reasons which override moral reasons, and they give you justification to do what you do. Yeah. Nonetheless, you're blameworthy.
Yeah. Great. Actually, this reminds me of something that was in Eleanor's question that I didn't respond to that I would say first, which is that the view is not that moral reasons always trump other reasons. It's that moral obligations trump other reasons. In fact, it's kind of a crucial part of the view that the existence of moral obligation is not the same thing as there being moral reasons in favor of it. But now, the challenge you're raising is, let me see if I've got it right. It would be incoherent to blame someone for doing something, but accept that they had sufficient moral reason to do what they did. Yeah. But you could coherently blame someone for doing something, believed they didn't have sufficient moral reason for doing what they did, but they did have sufficient reason, period, for doing what they did. Yeah. So I'm committed to denying that. And the reason is that blame isn't just a view about what there was moral reason for the person to do. It's a distinctive attitude which holds the other responsible. And if the person could convince us, not just that they had good reasons of self-interest that weighed against, but those reasons actually overrode the moral considerations, overrode the moral obligation, then I think they would have shown that what they were doing isn't blameworthy. So yes, I'm committed to thinking that blame is different from a view about what there's reasons from a point of view for doing. Blame presupposes that there was not reason, period, for the person to do what you're blaming them for doing. But thanks for the question, yeah.
Ralph seems to be the only survivor now.
So I enjoyed the talk very much. I just wanted to ask something about the importance of the question being asked, and it's connected to what seems intuitively more fundamental conceptually, morality or reasons.
Right.
So it seems to me that either by having conclusive reason to do something, we just mean the same thing as being morally obliged to do it, or we don't mean just the same thing,
right.
Okay? So in the former case, if we do, there's no question of what reason there is to do what's morally obliged. In the second case, it's conceptually possible that we might be morally obliged to do something for which we don't have conclusive reason or perhaps any reason to do it.
Right.
If that is conceptually possible, it seems to me then whether or not we have reasons isn't very important, because someone says, well, I don't see any reason for that. You can say, yeah, but you still ought to do it. So my intuition would be that that something is morally obliged is more fundamental, more central conceptually to considering what action to take than whether we have reasons to do it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely followed that, though. I mean, I thought there were two or three really interesting ideas in there that seem to me to go in somewhat different directions. So let me see here. So one thought you had is, well, I thought you ended up with a point that was potentially pretty friendly to me, because you were saying, well, maybe the deeper notion here is the idea of moral obligation, and this idea of a reason for an action is not so interesting, or it's downstream or something like that. Yeah, that seems to go too far to me, because I can clearly formulate questions about what to do where there's just no issue of moral obligation at all in the neighborhood, right? So I have a question about, I don't know, I lost the recharger to my beard trimmer yesterday. And I don't know, should I order one so it'll be waiting for me when I get home? Well, if I do that, it might get there too soon, somebody might take it, right, okay, what to do? And I think, well, what should I do? There's a question, what is the reason for me to do? And it looks like moral obligation is nowhere in the area. But I think it's important to what I'm arguing that the idea of moral obligation isn't the idea, certainly, of what there is reason to do, period. I mean, if it were, then there'd be a very simple victory. As you say, we just say, well, if we grant that something's morally obligatory, then of course there must be reason to do it, period, because the concept of moral obligation is just what there is reason to do, period. So the thought is, the concept of moral obligation is what there is reason to blame someone for not doing, were she not to do it without excuse. Okay? And that's a normative, that's a conceptual claim, and it's a reason-involving claim, to use Parfit's terms, because it entails the existence of reasons for blaming. And then I'm arguing that if there are reasons for blaming, there must be reasons not to do, because it'd be incoherent to blame the person for doing it, and hence unwarrantedly, would be unwarranted blame were the person to do it without excuse. Yeah.
If I could follow up, just suppose it did turn out that there weren't. Suppose it turned out there was a problem with that argument somewhere, and it could be the case that something is morally obligatory, despite the fact there isn't reason to do it, conclusive reason to do it.
Yeah.
Would that mean? I mean, I find that hard to conceive of. If someone said, well, this might be morally obligatory, but there's not conclusive reason to do it, I'd still be inclined to say, but you still should do it because the former consideration trumps the latter.
Yeah.
Conceptually. But maybe it.
Yeah. Well, I think,
to go into it.
you know, this is another thing that I think was implicit in what you were saying before that I didn't draw out sufficiently. Yeah. Darwall, come clean. Is it a conceptual truth that there's reason to do what we're morally obligated to do, or isn't it a conceptual truth? Because it looked like I was starting with the assumption that it isn't a conceptual truth, because I was saying, well, someone could coherently raise this question, why be moral? And that seems to be an open possibility in a way that the question, why should I do what there's reason for me to do, is not an open possibility. Okay? But then my argument seems to entail that actually it is a conceptual truth that we have reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. And I think there's a sense in which that's right. It's just a more complicated conceptual truth of a sort that it takes sort of reflecting on the connections between moral obligation and warranted blame, and thinking about the presuppositions of blame as involving necessarily the existence of reason not to have done what the person is being blamed for doing. Yeah.
If I could just make a small observation about excuses. It's fundamental to your account that moral obligation, something is morally obligatory if not doing it without an excuse is wrong. There's a reason period for blaming someone who does not do it without an excuse.
Right.
But excuses get wound into the definition in that way. If you thought of excuses as conditions which are the negation of negation of necessary conditions, so to speak, that sounds fine. But suppose there are people like J.L. Austin and H.L.A. Hart who have a completely different view about excuses. That the idea that accusations of blame are defeasible, and excuses are things which defeat them, but we can never actually spell out the complete conditions under which that defeating of the accusation is not accomplished. So, and I think that often in a court of law, the excuses start tumbling out one after the other until finally you see that the whole thing the judgment is without foundation altogether.
Right.
So that there seems to be an assumption about excuses here which may be metaphysically questionable.
Right. So, good. So there are three interrelated notions. The idea of wrongness, the idea of blameworthiness, and the idea of an excuse. Okay? And as I was talking, you might have gotten the idea that I was assuming that that the notion of excuse could be understood independently of the ideas of the blameworthy and of the idea of wrong. I actually don't think that. I think that the three are interconnected conceptually, and no one of them is conceptually prior. They're all conceptually connected. So there'd be no such thing as the blameworthy if there weren't such a thing as wrong, and if there weren't such a thing as the concept of excuse. There wouldn't be a concept of excuse if there weren't such a, So the three are interrelated. So I think I can just accept the Hart-Austin view of excuses as not being able to, say exactly what the excusing conditions are. We better be able to have some views about what are, and converge on some views about what conditions are excusing conditions. Otherwise, we can't get started. Yeah.
I mean, that is what you see in the eyes of that Italian skater,
Yeah.
isn't it? What's your excuse?
What's your excuse?
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
And,
Yeah. And he
yes.
might have had one for all we know.
yes. But it is, to elaborate your argument, you probably need to have a theory of excuses, wouldn't you?
Well, to make the conceptual claims, I don't know if you need a theory of excuses. You're certainly committed to the idea that it's a normative question which conditions excuse,
Yeah.
and it's a question that you can't decide independently of questions about blameworthiness and the wrong. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Yes, there is. A lady in the middle there.
I might just repeat some of the earlier questions, but
Yeah.
I noticed that you still use the terms trumping and overriding, so moral obligations override other
Yeah.
reasons and
Yeah.
trump other reasons.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I understood it that, I may have misunderstood you, but I thought that that's a wrong way to put it, because I think you would say there are only moral obligations. I mean, once there is a moral obligations, all these other readers are already gone. I mean, there's nothing to be trumped anymore, in a
Right.
sense. So it's not as if you have moral obligations and then all the other reasons, and then something has to happen.
Right.
There wouldn't have arisen a moral obligation if there had been stronger reasons. So
Right.
I wonder why you still use the terminology trumping and overriding. And I was also wondering whether it follows then that, so in order for there to be a moral obligation, an awful lot of reasons have to be taken into account.
Yeah.
So morality
Yeah.
becomes very difficult. I mean, in order to know whether someone really has a moral obligation, you need to know a lot about
Yeah.
all different kinds of reasons that could be important.
Good. I can't remember which one of these is on. Oh, okay, maybe both are on. Great. So, yeah, I see why you want to say the first thing, which is that it's important for me that moral obligations, that if there's a moral obligation, and if there has to be reason to comply with it. So to determine whether something is a moral obligation, we have to already bring in that the agent is one who has reasons of these other kinds, such that if we were to think that reasons of these other kind actually justify her in not performing the action, we'd be compelled to think logically that she actually isn't morally obligated to perform the action. So that's right, I want to say all of that. I think, though, that's compatible with thinking that some of these reasons still exist on the other side, okay? So one view is, well, they don't even exist at that point. I mean, there are various views we could take that are consistent with what I'm saying. One view would be the sort of McDowellian silencing view, that once we've got, McDowell doesn't talk about it in terms of moral obligation, but once we've got the moral obligation, then there are no reasons on the other side to be overridden. Those reasons are silenced or they're defeated. That would be one possibility. I actually don't find that plausible myself. I mean, it's probably true that of the morally best people, that they won't even consider those other reasons, but that doesn't mean that the reasons don't exist at all. Well, they do exist, it seems to me. And if they do exist, then I think we want to be able to say that even though they do exist, the agent has conclusive reason to do what she's morally obligated to do. We could put this thought in a sort of Razian way with an idea of an exclusionary reason. We might say that, well, when there's a moral obligation, even if there are these other reasons, there's also a reason that excludes consideration of those other reasons. But I think actually all of those ways of putting it are consistent with the argument I was making. But you're right on the second point, that to determine whether something is morally obligatory, you're really determining whether it'd be reasonable to demand that the person perform the action. And we can't really determine that independently of considering what other kinds of reasons there might be for the agent to act, including, for example, reasons concerning her own good. So that was the point of the conceptual possibility of supererogation. That was a case where some people might think that it's not morally obligatory to go into the building because that would be requiring an unreasonable sacrifice or unreasonably requiring a sacrifice. And so I just think that goes with the territory. I mean, that's part of what we're committed to thinking when we think that something is morally obligatory. That whatever other reasons there are don't actually, are not sufficiently important to outweigh the reasons there would be for blaming someone for failing to perform the action. Yeah.
There is time for one more question. I think the gentleman in the red shirt has been wanting to ask one. If you make it brief and to the point, that would be useful.
Thank you. I knew I shouldn't wear a blue shirt today. So this is in answer to your last point about whether blame is a more suspicious attitude than the others.
Yes, good.
So you'll know the argument against it. Williams' internal reasons and obscurity of blame gives you, I think, that reason. So very briefly, those who haven't read the paper. So you could just put it like this. You talked about the point of view, or having a reason from a point of view of your interest, but your interests don't have a point of view. Points of view are essentially points of view of agents. Likewise, there isn't a moral point of view. There's the point of view of the moral agent or something like that. So that on that basis, you could say, so all reasons are tied to points of view, which is to say they're agents' reasons. So when you do blame somebody, and if you're right, as I think Williams would say you are, that blame presupposes a reason, full stop, period, then there's something kind of strange going on. So his suggestion is, when you blame somebody, you hope that, from the agent's point of view, they had a reason not to do it, and you're kind of reminding them of that fact. And if they didn't, then you're optimistic, and the blame the practice of blaming could help them acquire such a reason.
Yeah.
So there's an obscurity there, that there could be something suspicious in blame, where that's not true of other attitudes.
Great. So that's a wonderful paper of Williams's that you're referring to. Was it Internal Reasons and the Obscurity of Blame? Yeah, I think, right, Williams is a skeptic about blame. On the one hand, he agrees with the conceptual thesis that I'm putting forward, namely that to blame someone is to be committed to thinking that there was reason for them not to have done what you're blaming them for doing. But because he holds his famous internal reasons thesis, he's a skeptic that could possibly be true, and so he's a skeptic about blame. So the internal reasons thesis, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that any normative reason for acting has to be grounded in what Williams called the agent's motivational set, S. Roughly the agent's desires or motivational capacities, how the agent is moved or would be moved under certain conditions. Now, I actually think there's a way of being an internalist, which, broadly construed, I agree with Williams about, while not being a skeptic about blame and not being a skeptic about reasons that come with moral obligations. But I think that's, to appreciate that, you have to sort of see the second person standpoint. You sort of have to see what it is to be viewing things from a distinctive second personal point of view. And notice how different the way Williams describes it, as you beautifully characterized it. I either hope that the agent will have had reason, or I try to bring it about that the agent has reason. I don't summon the agent to recognize the reason he has by virtue of our mutual relationship. In this way, it seems to me Williams is a Humean. I think Hume also was, though he uses the word blame all over the place, he doesn't quite get the second personal character of it. So, yeah, if the only attitude here was one where I either am just sort of hoping that someone has the reason, or I'm trying to give it to them by, speaking to them in a particularly harsh way, and then I scare them into having the reason. That's not the best way to put it. Or I call them to a vision or an ideal that they sort of already hold. If that's the way it was, then yeah, then I think we should be skeptics about it.
I think we've now run out of time. It remains for me to thank Stephen for an incredibly answering some really extraordinary questions too. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you.